Lesson 1 to create a common vocabulary and give students an introduction to statistical indicators of standard of living. The remaining lessons look at the specific impact of capitalist institutions on poverty. The activities in Lessons 2, 3, and 4 each focus on a single institution. The subject of Lesson 2, You're the Economist, is the institution of private property rights. Classroom learning activities deliberately eliminate the complexities of real-world conditions in order to focus on a specific phenomenon or conceptual construct. That simplification often extends to the use of fictitious data and scenarios. While simulated data sets are clearly valuable teaching aids, they sometimes have the unfortunate side effect of reinforcing students' suspicion that what happens in textbooks isn't the same as what happens in life. So FTE is excited that in You're the Economist, we can offer teachers and students real data about real people collected by real economists. You're the Economist is constructed around an economic field study conducted in Amazonian Brazil in the 1990s. The data sets were provided to the FTE by University of Colorado professor Lee Alston, one of the study directors. The activity gives students a realistic glimpse of how an economist might investigate whether an institution, in this case property rights, can assist or impede people's struggle to escape poverty. To prepare to conduct You're the Economist, we strongly suggest that you carefully read Appendix 1 of the Lesson 2 background outline. It's entitled Investigating the Relationships Between Property Rights and Economic Growth. Economists Study the Amazonian Frontier of Brazil. And the appendix provides a detailed background to the field investigation that generated the data included in You're the Economist. The appendix also has a case study and an overview of land reform efforts in 20th century Latin America. Based on the assumption that teachers are more comfortable and more effective when they know more than they teach, the appendix is a discussion of the methodology and conclusions of the land titling study. A caution here. The background material includes much more information than students are likely to need or find enjoyable. So it's not intended as a lecture guide, just a teacher resource. Familiarity with the setup, design, and conclusions of the field study will make it easier for you to set the activity in context, to address student questions, and to craft an effective debriefing. Assemble the materials for the activity ahead of time. In addition to the overhead transparencies and handouts, provide enough highlighters and inexpensive pocket calculators for pairs or small working groups of 3 or 4 students. You're the Economist is the type of classroom activity that works best when students understand the conceptual framework before they tackle the problem. First, they need knowledge of key terminology, including property rights. If you've studied property rights in class, a brief reminder is sufficient. But for students new to the term property rights in anything other than a conversational sense, a good way to begin is to ask them about the protest slogan, "People, not property." As you introduce the economist's conception of property rights into the discussion, students will understand why economists find that slogan nonsensical, because they operate on the assumption that property rights are the ultimate human right. Key vocabulary for this activity also includes institutions, capital, and economic growth. Once you've established the terminology, use the KWL model to review with students what they already know that will help them with the analysis tasks in You're the Economist. Students' initial reaction to a, quote, study of how property rights affects investment as a tool for reducing poverty is likely to receive a less than enthusiastic reception. Storytelling is an effective way to stimulate interest, and several are included in the Lesson 2 outline. My personal favorite is about goat stew chefs in the impoverished African nation of Malawi. Here's the story. Grace and John Terrera slaughter goats for a living. Demand is brisk. Malawians adore goat stew. The Terreras want to expand their business to meet this demand, but they lack capital. Mrs. Terrera thinks they need about 20,000 kwacha, about $250. This may not sound like much, but in Malawi, where the average annual income is only about $200, it could take years to raise such a sum. But wait! The house where the Terreras live is worth at least 25,000 kwacha. They bought the land 5 years ago and threw up a brick bungalow, fussily furnished and painted a satisfying shade of light blue. Surely they could borrow, using the house as security? No, because they can't prove they own it. The Toreras, like many poor people throughout the world, have no deed to their house and no title to their land. There's no official piece of paper they can point to, no land registry record that can back up their claim to property. They have property, but they have no property rights. Hernando de Soto, the Peruvian economist we've referred to before, would say that they have dead capital. As you discuss the Torera's situation, you're probably moving into an area about which students have very little knowledge, borrowing and debt. Use the role play about Mary and Jose, entitled, "What's the Same, What's Different?" to teach students about the wealth-producing potential of debt and the importance of collateral. As you return to the main activity, remember that one of the purposes of the lesson is to have students simulate economic research. Facilitate the transfer of skills and knowledge that students have been developing in science and writing courses by helping them to narrow a research question and construct a hypothesis. Maps included in the lesson materials locate the field study, and the journal excerpts from researcher Ricardo Tarifa help students create mental images of the region and the people. Just to get an idea, you know, everybody thinks that being an economist means sitting at a desk and doing boring things with a computer, but Ricardo's a little worried about snakes, so you might want to read that. Allow students time to read the excerpts from Ricardo's journal. Next, distribute the data chart and spend some time explaining the different column headings. Don't assume that they're self-explanatory. Most students have very little experience with land clearing and fencing, and I've yet to run into an American student who knows how big a hectare is. A hectare is about the size of 2 football fields, okay? And so the hectares cleared is the amount of land that was cleared by this owner. Divide the class into working pairs or groups of 3. Distribute the task direction sheet, highlighters, and calculators. Remind students that their goal is to determine whether or not the existence of title affects the settler's willingness to invest. What you're trying to figure out is there a difference in capital investment between those who have title and those who do not? The first task, then, is to determine which of the landholder's various activities represents investment. And investment is the committing of resources now in the expectation of getting greater returns later. Remind students that they are looking for landholders' choices designed to improve the productivity of the land, and that the size of any expenditure of resources is less important than its purpose in determining whether it's investment or consumption. Now, cattle, you have to think about the size here. Okay? When we're getting up to 200 cattle, that's definitely, yeah.
But like the people that have like 5 or 7, they're probably just doing it for like milk or...
Buying cattle could be considered an investment if you intended to buy cattle to build up a cattle herd. But this one's asking us specifically, what are you doing to invest in the productivity of the land resource that you're settled on or that you're the landholder of? Okay, so is clearing the land an investment? Yes, okay. So hopefully you got that column is going to be an important one. All right, what about planting permanent crops?
Yes.
Okay. Once students have identified the 4 data columns that represent investment, they can proceed to compare the level of investment made by landholders with secure title to the level made by those without.
Seems like the impression you get is more or less so that it'll have a higher value to sell that land.
Exactly, yeah.
So can you go beyond impressions to actually giving me a numerical piece of evidence?
You know, we could add up the hectares cleared per, or any of these.
Any of the 4, right?
Any of those 4, and we can divide it by the number, you know, get an average for each. For
Good plans,
the yes
Dan.
and the no's.
Plus 2,000, plus 3,000, plus 1,400.
Okay.
1,592.3.
Note to students that the level of statistical analysis that they're performing, calculating simple averages, is not sophisticated enough to support firm conclusions about the data. However, the averages can be used as indicators to see if there's evidence of a pattern that would make further statistical analysis worthwhile. Hopefully what you did was to add up the numbers in each column, divide by the number of landholders to see if we can come up with a real loose average of these things. Okay. Reconvene the large group and share the calculated averages. Everybody got them? Okay. All right, what about investment in permanent crops? Kevin, what did you guys come up with?
People with titles at about 20.3 as opposed to 15.1 for no title.
Okay, so again, title wins out. Remind students that their comparison of averages is a low-level analysis of the data, and that the economists conducted a number of highly sophisticated statistical analyses before coming to their conclusions. This is just an example of the kind of a study that a research economist would do, a field research economist would do. And I think it's important to note that averages aren't good enough. I mean, their book is full of sophisticated econometric analysis and calculus and the whole bit. But it does give us an indicator that at least there's a pattern there that maybe it is worth investigating a little farther. Finally, use this opportunity to remind students about both the power and the limitations of statistics. Ask them to use some additional investment data to predict whether or not a landholder has title. The fallacy of composition, assuming that what is true of the whole is true of each individual part, is readily demonstrated as students jump to inaccurate conclusions about the landholders in the new data set. What we want to do is to see if what we concluded has value in making us able to predict things. All right? So here are 4 settlers that I did not have on your chart. All right? And I want you to tell me, based on the data here, whether or not this person has title to his land. So the first one is Osdate, and all we know about him is that he didn't clear any land. So do we think this person has title or not?
Probably not.
All right, we don't see a whole lot of evidence of investment here, do we? Okay? All right, so does he have title? We're saying no. All right, what about the second guy? Okay, what makes you think that he has title? He's spending a lot of money and time on fencing, isn't he? What about the next one, Jose?
Maybe.
Oh, maybe. You guys are sitting on the fence. Is anybody going to make a prediction?
No.
All right, no? Okay, and what about Hermano?
Yeah.
All right, let's see what happens here. Okay, now, what happens? You have 2 of them that were not as you predicted. All right? And the only thing we want to show with this is that when we look at economic data, we're not talking about what an individual person would do. We're looking at aggregates. It's just like when you did supply and demand analysis and you said, okay, when the price of gasoline goes up, people buy less. And Kelly says, I don't. She may not, because there might be something in her situation that keeps her buying the same amount, and so she sacrifices somewhere else. It doesn't negate the law of demand. We know that if the price goes up, people are going to purchase less. We cannot say that Kelly individually will purchase less. Same thing is true here. If we can make a conclusion that having title to land is associated with making the investments that improve productivity, it doesn't mean that we can necessarily point out each individual farmer and say, well, based on these numbers, we know that this guy has or doesn't have title. The closure debriefing of this activity should focus on the study results as they impact our understanding of the incentives created by the institution of property rights. Having participated in the activity, students should be able to provide thoughtful answers to questions about how institutions can shape effective policies. For example, in what ways do defined, secure, and enforced property rights empower poor people? Or what kinds of policies in developing nations will create the incentives for investment that are necessary for economic growth?